All right, why don't we go ahead and get started? The clock approaches 12:02. Good afternoon, everyone. For those of you here on the East Coast, thank you for joining, and really pleased that you decided to take your lunch hour to be here with us for today's webinar. Acadia Center and Clean Air Task Force are very, very pleased to have the chance to present the second part of our webinar series on our newly released report, which is entitled "The Energy is About to Shift: Pathways to a Community-Centered, Resilient, and Decarbonized Grid for New England." Definitely want to offer a warm welcome to everyone joining, community groups, developers, labor groups, policymakers, tribal leaders, other interested stakeholders. We're, again, super pleased that you are taking the time to be with us today. As I mentioned, this is the second of a two-part webinar series on the report. We decided it was going to be too much ground to cover in one sitting, so we're covering the second part of the report today. And there will be links in the chat if you missed us back in December for part one. My name is Jamie Dickerson. I'm a senior director here at Acadia Center. For those who don't know us, Acadia Center is a climate and clean energy nonprofit based in Maine, working across the Northeast US and Canada and beyond on research, advocacy, and implementation efforts, all trying to advance bold, effective clean energy solutions for a livable climate and a stronger, more equitable economy. And we've been super happy to partner on this project with our colleagues at Clean Air Task Force. You all may know CATF is a global nonprofit organization, similarly working to safeguard against the worst impacts of climate change by catalyzing rapid development and deployment of low carbon solutions. CATF has offices in Boston, DC, and beyond, staff working across the world. So why don't we go ahead into the next slide and we'll start to dive into the Rona show and do some intros here. First of all, I do want to introduce my Acadia Center colleague, Dan Sosland, who founded and continues to lead Acadia Center as president. He's actually been working on this project the longest, I think, and was really instrumental in bringing it together and the framing and the approach we took. So super excited to have you all here, have the chance to hear from him in a few minutes. And we're also joined by Nicole and Natalie, Nicole Pavia and Natalie. I'm sorry, Natalie, I'm not sure I know how to pronounce your last name correctly. Menicius, is that right?
Good enough.
Good enough. At Clean Air Task Force. I definitely want to shout you guys out again in advance for being stellar partners in this endeavor. It's been a pleasure to work with your team. Natalie is a senior associate on, and Nicole is the director of Clean Air Task Force Clean Energy Infrastructure Team. Thanks for being here. So definitely drop your questions in the Q&A feature in Zoom throughout the webinar. We will be providing a copy of the slides and a recording afterward to attendees, so no need to take furious notes or screenshots or anything. On the left side of the slide, you'll see the run of show that we have planned for today. So after Dan provides some framing on this portion of the report, I'll give a quick recap of the first webinar that we held back in December. Then Nicole and Natalie will take the baton from there to discuss the meat of this part of the report, the findings on the region's siting, permitting, community engagement efforts for clean infrastructure. Their slides are going to zoom in on topics like land use and siting challenges, social barriers, historical impacts, and then really several of the great project case studies that are included in the report as well. So we'll make sure to save plenty of time for Q&A. Do stay for that. And as I said, get your questions in throughout. So without further ado, let's dive in. We'll go to the next slide, please, and I'll pass things off to you, Dan.
Well, thank you, Jamie, and thank you everyone for joining. This has been a great project and a great partnership between the two organizations, matching skill sets and working very hard. So it's a real pleasure to be able to speak today about the report. I'm just going to offer a few thoughts on how the report came to be and what we've been trying to do, because this goes back several years where Acadia Center and Clean Air Task Force were talking about issues facing the really large and unprecedented almost build out needed in clean energy generation and clean energy infrastructure, and trying to talk about the challenges that are faced in building that infrastructure out in a timely way to meet climate goals and clean energy goals. Communities, of course, are critical. They are the places where projects get sited. and affect permitting. And there has been, as I think most people are aware, varying reactions by communities to different kinds of clean energy projects. Some are proceeding fine, and some get bogged down in litigation. There's disinformation campaigns that happen that affect communities that then pass ordinances banning clean energy. But at the same time, communities have legitimate concerns about the quality of life in their community. They need to be able to participate. We have a very strong home rule tradition in this part of the country, giving people in their towns an awful lot of authority. So the two themes really are the scale of the build out and the need to embrace communities and have them feel a part of the system in order collectively to meet clean energy and climate targets on time. A lot of, for me, the impetus for the project came from some social science work that's been done, particularly a social scientist in New Brunswick, Louise Comeau. And I wanted to reference her directly because her work is really outstanding. She's done a number of studies in New Brunswick province, working with communities, and it's really eye-opening because it suggests that some of the assumptions that may be made around what communities are concerned about really aren't necessarily correct. So if there's an assumption that they don't support climate activism or they don't support clean energy, the real finding from her work that has influenced this project has a lot to do with trust and a lot to do with a lack of trust by communities in the permitting and review processes, a sense that they can't participate effectively. They have to hire lawyers. The real decisions that are being made somewhere else. And it's that trust issue that we need to recognize as a potential hurdle in a way, and fashion ways to get around that so that appropriate infrastructure is built on a good timeline. And that's really the key point here. If we're going to meet our climate goals, we need to build the right projects on the right timetable, but that's going to require the right kind of community engagement and processes they trust. So what this report does is it provides a really large amount of information around the infrastructure build-out that's needed, the state goals that have been established, and what they mean for the level of infrastructure and generation that's required both at the large generation level and at the distributed community level. It also makes recommendations on how to support community engagement so that it's based on information, so that the processes work for people. Don't feel blindsided, and they don't feel talked down to. And in that process, we would think that reforms that support community engagement, and the recommendations are in this report, will also be a way of immunizing the process from disinformation and really focusing on good information and making good decisions. So with that, I want to thank both the Acadia Center team and the Clean Air Task Force team that spent so much time, worked so well together on this report. We hope it's a useful framework, it has useful information, and look forward to working with all of you and others to really set up a good system that works for everyone in the region. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. Really appreciate that. So let's dive in with that framing in mind. We'll go to the next slide. By way of brief recap of part one of this webinar series, as I mentioned, this is a summary slide outlining what we really dissected back in December. To simplify things, the December webinar was really about digging into these numbers that you see and the real energy system mechanics. And today's webinar is going to be more about the human element, the people, the communities, the land, and beyond. But just very briefly, you see in these three columns some of the key top-line findings from the first part of our report. And we basically took a look at 5 prominent decarbonization studies, and each of them were modeling future energy system outcomes for New England to achieve that would be needed to achieve 2050 decarbonization targets. If you can, at a quick glance, you probably see the macro takeaway here, which is that pretty much every category of indicator saw major increases on average across the 5 studies between 2020 and 2050, from things like peak demand and annual demand growing by roughly 2x over that time period, to installed generation capacity, which could grow by more than 3 times even, led by solar and offshore wind and energy storage. But also parameters like interregional transmission capacity and electricity imports to and from neighboring regions. So depending on how the region, its states and communities plan and make policy, as Dan alluded to, this type of build out will in all likelihood contain very notable impacts for siting, for land use, permitting, interconnection, community engagement, and beyond. So keep the framing offered by these numbers in the back of your mind as we get into the research and the qualitative findings of the report. This is really the foundation for the task ahead of us collectively. So I will stop there. Let's go to the next slide. I'll hand things off to you, Nicole. Nicole's going to take us through some of those excellent research findings on the state of play in the region and lessons to be learned. So, Nicole?
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jamie. And thank you, Dan, also for sharing your thoughts. I just want to reiterate, this is an amazing partnership between the Clean Air Task Force and Acadia Center. And we're really excited to offer this report to everyone. And like Dan said, hope it offers a helpful framework for thinking through the future of clean energy infrastructure deployment in New England. Like Jamie just mentioned, we went through a few top line findings from the first half of our report, and what we covered also in our first webinar. Those sections focus on kind of how much we need to build to decarbonize New England. But it's not only about how much we need to build, like Jamie and Dan have said, it's also about where we build things and with whom we build things, and the real world implications for communities in all of that. Successful clean energy deployment requires community involvement and engagement in planning and development processes. So the findings we'll be discussing today are grounded not only in the latest research on community engagement, but also in a set of 6 case studies diving into New England community experiences with different kinds of clean energy. And for these case studies, we conducted desktop research and interviews with local communities and stakeholders, and we will share some findings from those on later slides. So this research and community conversations inform the report's identification of key barriers to achieving equitable and timely decarbonization in New England. And we put forth here 3 buckets of challenges, which we will work through also throughout this webinar, and we posit some opportunities to address them in the report. So just to quickly run through them, the first bucket is policy process and capacity challenges, including things like permitting, local agency capacity, and community resources and time needed to engage with infrastructure deployment. The second is land use and siting challenges. Who decides where infrastructure should go, especially when so much land is already in use for other purposes, and there isn't a lot of land to go around in New England. And community engagement challenges is the third bucket, or issues that developers or policymakers might have, including the community meaningfully in planning and building infrastructure. And with that, we can go to the next slide, please. So as I alluded to, we conducted 6 case studies for this report. I'll run through them really quickly here, and we will highlight 3 of the 6 case studies. You can see marked with the green dots as we go through today's presentation. Our first case study was of Vineyard Wind, an offshore wind project off the coast of Massachusetts. The second was King Pine Wind and LS Power Grid in Maine, which involves both transmission and onshore wind technology. East Eagle Substation, which is a substation located in East Boston. Cranberry Point Energy Storage Project, which is a battery storage project in Massachusetts. And Twin States Clean Energy Link, an electricity transmission line between New Hampshire and Vermont. And we will cover 3. Unfortunately, we don't have time to cover all 6 today, but please see the appendix of our report for all the case studies in full detail. And each of the case studies that we're going to discuss sheds some light onto the buckets of challenges that I just mentioned on the last slide. And before we dive into exploring more of the challenges and opportunities and specific case studies, we're aiming to present and report on case studies in an objective manner. And coverage of these projects in our reports is not an endorsement of any of the projects, or is it us passing any type of judgment on the projects the developer, relationships with the community, or the community's actions throughout the course of the project. We are really eager to share learning so that others might take best practices from or learn from these project and community experiences. Next slide, please. So to dive a little bit more deeply into the challenges and set the stage for our first case study discussion, we noticed through our research that there were several policy, process, and capacity barriers in New England. And many of you will know these challenges are not unique to New England, but they did emerge as critical in our conversations with stakeholders. And there is some progress to discuss in the region that starts addressing some of these issues. So first, there is a wide range of heterogeneity across states around the level of jurisdiction for siting and permitting decision making. So in some states, decisions around where clean energy can be sited is left entirely to local governments. And local leaders and community members might be hearing about technologies or projects for the first time. They might not have the proper resources or time to research, plan for, and integrate these new technologies and new projects into the vision for their community. And due to the newness of some of these technologies, general skepticism of developers, or really myriad other reasons, communities might react with bans or moratoria for clean energy technologies. On the other side of the jurisdiction discussion, some states centralize a lot of their siting decisions at the state level. But many states in New England and also across the country allow for local jurisdiction on smaller projects and require state level approvals and permits for larger projects. But any way you slice it, the current siting and permitting paradigm in New England results in a regulatory patchwork that can greatly vary from county to county and state to state, and can cause confusion and no-go zones for developers. We identified through our research several opportunities to navigate the complex regulatory and social dynamics that we listed above and just discussed, and create policies and processes that work for all actors involved in clean energy deployment. Comprehensive siting and permitting reforms, for example, can help clarify decision-making processes, better coordinate all actors required for permitting, streamline and expedite permitting processes, and require community engagement as part of a formal approvals process. Increasing government capacity to process permits and provide impartial technical assistance to communities can give communities more confidence in and a better understanding of new technologies that might be coming into their neighborhoods. One recent effort we wanted to highlight as part of this discussion around these challenges is Massachusetts' new siting and permitting policy reform. This new policy sets a clearer path for developers and communities by consolidating and streamlining approvals processes, developing separate tracks for large and small projects, and specifically aims to improve community engagement and the related processes around that. Next slide, please. So now we're going to dive into our first case study, which is on the Johnston Windsor 3 solar project. And this project highlights some of the jurisdictional challenges, the levels of approval needed for projects, and several other challenges between the developer and the community and the approvals process in general. We thought this was a really insightful case study to cover here. So Green Development, which is a Rhode Island renewables developer, proposed 5 separate solar farm projects in the Johnston, Rhode Island area and to the boards there, including the Windsor 3 project. So this particular project, the Windsor 3 project, included a 90,000 panel, 24 megawatt solar farm on land near residential communities. And the project faced significant community backlash and concern, mostly over the project's proximity to forests and also to residential neighborhoods. And another complicating factor was that this plot of land was zoned as residential. Another thing I want to mention about Rhode Island in particular, which is very relevant to this case study, is that in Rhode Island, deforestation is tied to solar development, with 69% of all forest loss between 2018 and 2021 due to clearing for solar installations. So I just wanted to mention that as it is top of mind for communities in Rhode Island. In Johnston, because of the project's proposed location on residential land, it was required that the project go both before the planning board of Johnston and receive a supermajority vote and special permits from the Johnston zoning board. So the planning board approved all the solar farm plans, everything seemed fine, but then the zoning board failed to provide a supermajority vote. And this led to a series of town halls and even court battles between the developer, the zoning board, and the Rhode Island Supreme Court about the need for a supermajority vote, the kind of process that was required, if that was necessary, among other things. And during this time, Johnston also attempted to pass a ban on all large-scale solar development on land zoned for residential use. This ban ended up being denied, but just wanted to note that as well. And as of July 2024, there was still a back and forth ongoing between the developer and the zoning board. So the future of this project is still up in the air. And we wanted to highlight this project because it is an example of how complex local dynamics are and the nuances of every particular development in the clean energy space. One policy-related development to share is that Rhode Island passed comprehensive solar siting reform legislation, which disincentivizes solar development in core forest land and provides incentives for projects on preferred sites, like brownfields, landfills, along highways, other land that's already, like more brownfield-related areas. But time will tell what the impacts of these policies are on solar development in the state of Rhode Island. And with that, I will pass it to my colleague, Natalie. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Nicole. That's a great segue into our next slide here on land use and siting challenges. So we know that there is enough land in New England to meet the technical need for clean energy. However, there are many factors that make a site suitable for a single energy project. This includes having the right landscape characteristics, proximity to transmission infrastructure, having large enough parcel size, or the ability to aggregate parcels, especially when it comes to linear infrastructure like transmission lines. And then there are also other factors that might influence whether or not a site can be developed, like land prices, a landowner's willingness to sell, the local zoning regulations, and support or opposition from local communities. As well, the land that's easiest to develop is the low-hanging fruit, meaning that it's probably going to become more challenging in the coming years to find suitable sites. And then on the broader scale, there are also a lot of tensions around how land is used. As a limited resource, there are competing interests for agriculture, housing, industry, conservation, and others. And this plays out both for specific projects and at the regional level. In New England, these land use conflicts are particularly heightened due to the region's relatively small geographic size, existing concerns around loss of agricultural land from expanding low-density housing, and concerns over the conversion of prime forest land. And when developing energy projects, particularly solar on brownfields, landfills, and rooftops and other already disturbed lands, these play an important role, but they alone cannot cost-effectively meet all of the region's energy needs. And so identifying low conflict lands that are suitable for larger scale projects will be really crucial. All of this is to say that when you add up all these considerations, the land that's practically suitable is much less than what we know is technically feasible for the region. And so to ensure that we have the land that's practically suitable to build the energy infrastructure we need and minimize impact, we have a few recommendations laid out in the report. The first is to integrate energy planning into local, regional, and state land use planning processes, both to understand the trade-offs of energy with other land uses and to align energy deployment with long-term community goals. State energy planning processes should also strive to integrate other cross-sectoral stakeholders into these planning processes to coordinate conversations. So that means like bringing agriculture into conversations around energy deployment as well. As well, policymakers should incentivize low-impact development practices and consider cumulative impacts where energy is developed so as not to overburden any one community or further burden already marginalized communities. And we'll touch more on this in a bit. And finally, policymakers should also balance wildlife and farmland protections to ensure that the most productive lands are protected, while also making sure that there is still enough land to meet clean energy needs. State agencies could help this by developing best management practices that project developers can take to minimize impact on agricultural and wildlife habitat. And we can go to the next slide. So now we're going to turn to a case study that exemplifies both a positive siting outcome as well as the challenges of siting clean energy projects. So this case study covers two projects, both of which are in Maine, the King Pine Wind Facility in Aroostook County and the Aroostook Renewable Gateway Transmission Line, which would run 160 miles down the eastern portion of the state. Both of these projects secured power purchase agreements with Maine and Massachusetts in 2022. The wind project, which will be 1,000 megawatts with around 170 turbines, received generally positive reception from the public as it was sited on land that was previously used for logging, and as such, it would not raise too many further environmental or viewshed concerns. And as well, the developers had a relatively good reputation in the region from other projects they'd worked on, and they did a good job of communicating the economic benefits for the local community. So this also exemplifies one of those least conflict lands that made a good candidate for a project like this. The other project was a transmission line that faced far more challenges. So this line was 160 miles, a 345 kilovolt line that would run from Glenwood Plantation down to Cooper's Mills. The line was generally well received until the developer released the proposed routing, and then community opposition grew really quickly, with residents expressing concerns over impacts on the environment, property values, farms, other businesses, state tourism, and local economies. The local advocacy group that led many of the landowners in opposition efforts also hired an attorney who helped fight the New England Clean Energy Connect project as well, another contentious project in the region. And efforts went all the way up to the state legislature to try and revoke project approval and to require the developer to follow an alternative pathway or to get the line undergrounded. The developers looked into getting the line undergrounded, but it was unviable because they found that it would increase the project cost by fivefold. And then locally, over 11 towns along the proposed route also enacted moratoria against the project to try and get the developer to readjust the line. Ultimately, the transmission line was canceled in December of 2023. And although the opposition was strong, the project's cancellation really stemmed from unresolved disputes with the State Public Utilities Commission over cost increases that were brought on by delays and inflation. And because of this, the developer could no longer hold on to the terms of their bid for the project. And then recently, this past October, the federal government has issued a $425 million capacity contract to a different developer, Avangrid, for a similar project. So that's something to watch. And the challenges of siting this transmission line highlight the strong opposition that can emerge when communities do not feel that they were adequately engaged in decision-making processes or siting conversations. And then the challenges the line faced also highlight the financial vulnerability of many of these projects and raise an opportunity to reform state procurement processes to account for evolving project needs if reasonable. Next slide. So moving on to our final bucket here on social barriers and historical impacts. We know that community support or opposition can make or break a project, and there are many drivers as to why community opposition may emerge. This includes land use changes to community aesthetics and identity, localized environmental impacts, noise and health and safety concerns as well. However, one of the primary contributors to community opposition is a lack of perceived procedural equity, meaning that the process of community engagement and the ability of the community to have a say or influence over the project was inadequate. An MIT study from 2022 found that 30% of opposition to renewable projects in the United States stemmed from a lack of procedural equity. As well, projects that are high profile and fail, or stories of bad actors, can spread really quickly and taint unrelated projects in other communities as well. Another piece of the puzzle for New England is that there's a legacy of over-reliance on fossil fuel and infrastructure and a general distrust of institutions. Communities across the region have felt the impacts of chronic fuel shortages, high electricity rates, and winter energy shortfalls. Heavily polluting fossil fuel infrastructure has also impacted the health and well-being of communities, particularly marginalized and disadvantaged communities. And many interviewees from our case studies express concern over further burdening these communities or overburdening others with concentrated infrastructure development. And then we have also seen direct interference from vested interests. A study from Brown University found that some community organizations that oppose offshore wind off the coast of Massachusetts and Rhode Island are funded and resourced by fossil fuel interested donors. This involvement, as well as other involvement around campaigns and misinformation or lobbying from these groups, makes it more challenging for transparent engagement around energy deployment to take place. So to highlight some options and opportunities here, one recommendation is to facilitate proactive communication and engagement from developers. I know many of us have heard the term early and often engagement before, and we're probably sick of hearing it, but we're going to reiterate that importance here again today, but additionally talk about some other things. So developers can also be more effective about communicating the impacts of a project, both the positive and negative, as well as improve the processes of engagement themselves. So for example, creating meaningful opportunities to influence project siting, design, and decision-making at the outset, and communicating how concerns were addressed and how those changes materialized in the project as well. As well, developers, communities, and governments should work together to deliver additional benefits from a project. So these can be negotiated community benefits agreements or workforce opportunities, or even improvements to surrounding environment or infrastructure. And then finally, policymakers can modify permitting standards and processes to account for cumulative impacts of a proposed project in a community, which means taking into account the existing energy or other infrastructure when issuing permits, so as to limit further burden on communities that have already been overburdened. And next slide. So turning to our last case study, this is on the East Eagle substation in East Boston. East Boston is a largely working class and immigrant community that is located near Logan International Airport. The community already has significant environmental and noise pollution from surrounding infrastructure. And this case study highlights the concern over cumulative impact and the impact of poor outreach and frustration over the lack of community inclusion in decision-making processes on behalf of the utility, the city, and the state. So this project was to construct a new substation. It was initially proposed in 2014 by the utility Eversource to account for growing energy demand and to relieve pressure on an existing substation in Chelsea, which was already at capacity. After the city and the utility negotiated a land swap 4 years after the project was first proposed, community opposition grew pretty quick. The proposed site for the substation is close to Chelsea Creek. It's also next to a playground and adjacent to jet fuel and heating oil storage facilities from the airport. And the community was highly concerned about the safety of the facility due to flood risk from their proximity to the water, fire concerns, and they were also frustrated over additional infrastructure that was in a community that already has a lot of industrial activity. And while activists recognize the need for the substation within the electricity system, they are mostly frustrated by the failures of the utility to conduct early outreach, including last-minute scheduling of meetings and hearings and inadequate translation services. There were also multiple lawsuits and appeals throughout the years, and it took 8 years for the project to finally receive full approvals, and the project began construction in 2023 in January. And while the utility ultimately signed a $1.4 million community benefits agreements with local community groups, additional concerns arose over the costs of the CBA, and ultimately those costs, concerns over those costs being put back on ratepayers. They raised some red flags about how costs for CBAs can fit into capital structures and the guaranteed rate of return that utilities benefit from them. And with that, I'll pass it over to Jamie to wrap us up.
Thank you, Natalie. That was a tour de force, great whirlwind presentation. So thank you so much. If we can flip back to that last slide really quick, just take one moment to indulge in some storytelling. We conducted one amazing case study interview on this project. The team at Green Roots was kind enough to talk with us. And one of the anecdotes for me that really brought home the sort of the human element of this particular situation related to the community's love for that playground, the American Legion playground. as someone who grew up in the North Shore of Boston, having played Little League in East Boston and other places in the area, there was pre-existing tension and over the like too many people wanted to use the playground. There was the Italian and Irish immigrant communities who've been there for decades who loved it for playing baseball, and there were the more recent Spanish-speaking communities who loved it for playing soccer. And I just, the fact that that's the type of anecdote that these case studies really revealed for us that, made these projects much more deep than just like what you read about in the stories in the press. So I do want to commend the CATF team for really conducting some of those amazing behind the scenes case study interviews. So that's my storytelling minute. We do want to move over to Q&A. Please do submit your Q&A into the Q&A function in Zoom. I'm looking to see now whether we've got any questions that have been coming in. To get us started, maybe I can just ask Nicole and Natalie to reflect a little bit on the case study process overall. We talked about 3 of the projects today. We did 3 others. What was it like, interviewing project proponents and opponents in this region? Maybe you could compare and contrast that to some of the case studies you've done across the rest of the country, or if there was anything particular about this region that just sort of stood out in that process.
Yeah, thanks, Jamie. This was definitely the case studies. I think it was really interesting to hear the perspectives and how nuanced I think every single project is. Your story about the playground really highlights just how much like places mean to people. And so the attachment to the region, I think, was something that really stood out for me, both of like how people in New England love New England and also their communities as well. And I think that came through in every interview that we conducted, whether it was a developer or a community. I think people really recognize the importance of that in the region. And so that was something that definitely stood out to me.
Yeah, I would echo everything Natalie said. I think also there was a lot of emphasis on conservation, concerned for preserving wildlife and habitats, but also an acknowledgement of the fact that, there is an energy transition going on and that resources, should be built. It's just a matter of where and if the processes are the right fit for the community and if the community feels bought in to the process.
That's great. Yeah, appreciate those answers. Keep getting your Q&A added, folks. I see one just came in. Let's check. I guess a question is like, what models are out there that can be useful in informing siting decisions that consider land use and other factors? The questioner cites a couple of them, one from NREL, the National Renewable Energy Lab, and I think there's a reference to the Nature Conservancy, Massachusetts, with a similar framework or a different framework. So are these types of like pre-existing best practices frameworks generally useful for whether it's a state energy facility siting board or a local community? I assume there isn't far from consistent utilization across the board, but did you guys encounter localities or state entities making use of those?
Yeah, I think that there are a lot of models out there for least conflict lands modeling that can provide a really good example of how to bring multiple stakeholders into a conversation. I've seen it in California and in the state of Washington as well, about the state can bring together different stakeholders, so industry, agriculture, conservation, into land use planning processes to discuss the broader implications and kind of get everyone in the same room and identify what kinds of lands and also discuss the trade-offs of different energy infrastructure or the trade-offs of losing some agricultural land as well. So that can play out at the state level. But I think that these conversations are also important to both be brought down to local and regional levels as well, and to have local and regional conversations also inform the state processes too. So having these conversations proactively within local communities, so engaging a county or municipal or town in this kind of land use planning and proactively thinking about how energy infrastructure could fit into their long-term goals will help them both capture the benefits of energy projects earlier on and minimize the impact and kind of help them offset the trade-offs and minimize the impact of where land is sited to. So if a town can proactively work and be well resourced by with technical assistance from the state too, I think that those kinds of conversations will be really important to happen.
Excellent. That's great. We had another question come in on do you have, well, it's the question is about the broad topic of cumulative impacts. So maybe we can spend a few minutes talking about that. The particular question is insights on how to handle the potential for cumulative impacts. I think the question might be referring to DG projects, distributed generation projects that seek to locate closest to hosting capacity on the grid, whether it's the distribution system or the transmission system, which, as the questioner points out, can lead to sort of a clustering of projects in certain towns or regions. So this is where the convergence of, how you study where there's space on the grid to accommodate new generation versus how you study where there's land available or physical resources available. And so I'll open it up to Nicole, Natalie, Dan. Any insights on that? I've got a few thoughts of my own, but how do we bring those two together?
Oh, Natalie, I saw you're off mute, but do you want to go first?
Yeah, I think that it's a very interesting question because the cumulative impacts, I think also for some broader framing, the way that we've seen cumulative impacts play out in state policies so far have mostly been around pollution and how to mitigate adding pollution from polluting facilities into communities. And so that provides a very scientific grounding of how to make those assessments when issuing permits. And so bringing this conversation into things where you're thinking about capacity and clustering around existing like infrastructure and where it makes the most sense to build gets a little bit more tricky. And so I think I would kind of lean towards a hierarchy too of looking at communities that have already other kinds of industrial activity around them and infrastructure and trying to minimize cumulative impacts in those communities first, while also seeking to maximize we know that a big part of our ability to achieve the deployment that we need is going to be about maximizing deployment and making the most of the infrastructure that we already have. So I think it's a tricky thing to balance. And yeah, Jamie, I know that you had some thoughts you wanted to add as well, so I'll pass it back over to you.
Do you want to go first, Nicole? I can go.
No, I was just going to say one other quick, kind of tangential thing, but something that we're thinking about too at CATF a lot right now is the way that benefits accrue or don't accrue to communities hosting infrastructure. There are community benefits agreements and programs that are in place, that are in development right now. For some communities, when infrastructure was built, many decades ago, they were never consulted, they were never asked about the infrastructure, and they've, had to burden a lot of the impacts of the infrastructure. So something we're thinking about too is when we build new infrastructure, are there ways that we can better guarantee that communities will see benefits, whether, community like social benefits, new institutions, monetary benefits, can they be paid from some kind of a fund for, hosting this infrastructure in their community? So I just wanted to add that as another angle of this whole conversation that we've been looking into.
Yeah, that's great. So the question is really timely. This question of cumulative impacts was one of I think the real salient policy questions that was debated in the Massachusetts climate bill that passed late last year, and it included some requirements I think for the first time for the Energy Facilities Siting Board within the DPU to start applying standards for assessing cumulative impacts. So don't just look at the immediate application on the desk in front of you, but assess the context around an application in terms of previously cited and approved projects. I think the challenge that the question highlights is that a lot of this clustering has been happening historically at distribution level cited projects. So these are typically solar projects, 5 megawatts and below, that are interconnecting to the local utilities grid. And most of their approvals, siting and permitting wise, historically have been at the local level. So some localities may apply a lens of cumulative impact assessment, but I think by and large, those local level approvals are pretty project specific. And and they may not be able to take into account, for example, in central or western Massachusetts, if there's 800 megawatts of 5 megawatt solar projects, that's starting to cause, grid issues. Not every particular locality has the full visibility into, the cumulative, I'd say, regional impact of the projects that are, affecting the land use in that area. So hopefully the new Massachusetts law will allow more of those projects to go into the Energy Facility Siting Board project process, where there can be sort of a central application of a consistent cumulative impacts lens at the state level. So great question, though. Really great. Dan, I wanted to tee up a question for you. One of the questioners is sort of asking about innovative models from other countries and like sort of what we can learn in the US and what we can learn specifically within the New England region. The question has an innovative example of, I think, reusing and repurposing, multi-purposing existing linear infrastructure, whether it's highways or train right-of-ways. And we have seen some thinking about, using road right-of-ways for transmission siting, for example. But whether specific or in the abstract, Dan, how would you say this region can learn from best practices in other parts of the world?
It's a great question because I think we all want to aspire to best practices and be innovative, and maybe we'll develop some here that other areas can copy. The examples you gave are ones that not only should be on a list, but they also strike people as common sense, like repurposing places that have been developed, brownfield sites, landfills, right? And certain state statutes do promote development at these facilities, but more could be done there. It makes a lot more sense to reuse, repurpose existing sites, given, other community issues. And other best practices that I know we're looking at in other parts of the world, but even over the border in Canada, there's some really interesting examples of community ownership in projects in the Gaspé and in Quebec and other places. So really thinking of communities as partners in that sense, it's become sort of a part of the menu. And so there's a lot we can learn. And I think that really all this can go to, we're in a process where the permitting system and the community benefits, the discussions are starting to be prioritized by states and others. As this massive buildup is occurring, we can't use this old system. It's just too fragmented and underfunded, and it's too much to ask of certain communities. So whether it's cumulative benefits or trying to map out around a state, where projects are needed, maybe they're getting clustered in ways that aren't helpful to the distribution utility. All of these things should be on the table, to come up with a really good system that is working for our common goals and there's good buy-in and it's efficient.
Excellent. Thank you, Dan. Great response. Maybe for the full panel, I want to ask a question about zeroing in on transmission and linear infrastructure siting. I think over the last 10 years, I've seen a shift in this region of the siting debate being primarily focused on generation resources, solar and wind, to increasingly, I think, a recognition, although, yeah, I guess NECEC has been around for almost 10 years now, so it's not like it hasn't been there before, but an increased focus on siting of transmission facilities and what that means given the inherent nature of a couple 100-mile line compared to a couple 100-acre facility in one community for a generation project. So Natalie and Nicole, maybe you could just sort of expound on some of the findings from the transmission related case studies and highlight any unique takeaways from those compared to, more concentrated projects in their footprints. And then Dan, maybe you can give a little bit of a main perspective on sort of the controversial general topic of transmission development that Maine has seen and whether there's a path forward to finding a more harmonious solution in the future.
Yeah, I could start. I think, generally transmission siting is becoming much more of a relevant conversation, not only in New England, but across the country because of our need for longer distance lines that are high voltage. And our typical methods of developing transmission are often left to utilities and transmission operators who are incentivized to often build shorter lines and stay within one state where they know the regulations and they're familiar with the grid. The need for longer lines crossing over different states is becoming a much more emerging topic of conversation. There's a lot of every state kind of has its own regulatory requirements for transmission. There are questions of, who is going to pay for what pieces of the project. And then there's the conversation around community benefits, like I alluded to earlier. It's easy or easier, I shouldn't say easy, easier to discuss community benefits programs with one or two communities, next to a wind farm or a solar farm. But if you have a line that's cutting through maybe hundreds of communities, that's a lot more difficult of a conversation, not only for all the communities along the line, but also for the developer. And there's the added piece in this region of looking to connect internationally as well to Canada, where there are great hydro resources that states all over New England and me in New York, we're aiming to benefit from that as well. But there are challenges with regulatory permitting issues across borders too. So I think some of the just high level issues that we've seen arise, not only at the community level, but even at the state level, is determining the kind of fair share between states of who is hosting a lot of the infrastructure. Do they feel like the other state isn't paying enough into the project? Do developers, is it easier to build in one state versus the neighboring state? Those are kind of like high level issues. And then at the community level as well, transmission lines can run through a lot of different areas, obviously. And so it could run through, protected forest lands. It could run through, other culturally and socially important places. And undergrounding lines also is nice to think about and to consider, but also is extremely expensive and increases the cost a lot of transmission. So just a higher level framing, and I'll leave it at that and pass it to Natalie and Dan as well.
Well, I'll just comment to respond to your prompt, Jamie. So I think anyone on the webinar who's familiar with the NECEC line in Maine knows what it's an example we do not want to repeat, and it illustrates a lot of the issues that need to be addressed in permitting and good planning and community engagement. Community engagement was attempted by the developer, and but one of the issues I think that needs to be grappled with is when projects are proposed by a developer that's seen as having a profit outcome. That in of itself creates a dynamic with communities that does not necessarily set the table in a level playing field, and does not necessarily encourage a dialogue around what should happen, because you don't know if you should trust the information or not. It doesn't mean that project developers are not giving good information. What it means is there's a dynamic there and an imbalance in resources. And I think that that's something going forward that needs to be taken into account. Who's making the decision that if the line, people would like to see a line undergrounded, it's much more expensive, but it would protect a resource on the Kennebec River. Who's making that decision? Because if it's the project developer, they're going to make that decision based on cost. If there's some other process that might include cost recovery, I don't know. But that says, the value of that resource, the recreational and ecological value, is so high that it justifies a change in the project. Where's the forum to have that discussion? Right now it's potentially with the state permitting authority, but it's all very, very fragmented. $80 million was spent on the referendum around that line, and 70 something, we don't remember exactly, percent of the vote came in to stop the line. So you can see public the public had a real concern with it. Then a Supreme Court decision said that the referendum was unconstitutional. So now it's being built and it's on a schedule. That is not the way we want clean energy infrastructure to be developed in this region or anywhere. It leaves a bad taste in everyone's mouth. We all are in this together in the climate crisis. We're all in this together and receiving the benefits of clean energy. And hopefully we can all be in this together in a better process to site and permit the right kind of infrastructure to get support. So it's a good case study. I think we're learning everyone's learning a lot from that, including the developers. And I think we all want to see a better system in place going forward.
That's great. Thanks for those reflections, Dan. We have 3 minutes till the top of the hour. A brief follow-up question that one of our attendees submitted was a question about specifically related to transmission infrastructure, but rather than new lines, focusing on upgrading existing lines and existing rights of way. So the question to the panel is, do you foresee issues with community engagement specific to improving those existing pieces of infrastructure? As a starting point, I do assume that if a new application would have to go before an EFSB type of authority, that there would have to be some minimum level of community engagement. But whether from your case studies or your other research, Natalie and Nicole, have you guys encountered any sort of rebuild, reconductoring type of community engagement examples? Or if not, could you predict which way they might go?
You know, I don't have any immediate examples top of mind, but I could imagine that re-energizing, repowering, or just improving the efficiency of existing lines would help a lot, or at least doing that first before proposing, new rights of way. I think, in a lot of the case studies, we found a lot of people were like, oh, why can't we build on, brownfield, landfills, existing rights of way along highways? There's a lot of movement right now in the transmission space to be much more flexible about thinking about repowering and using areas that are already ideal for building linear infrastructure instead of cutting into new territory. So I do think, sometimes that could require a slight widening of a right of way, let's say, or, another environmental evaluation if there are resources like on the outskirts that are implicated. But so there would be some community engagement also needed, and I'm sure there would be a process for that. But overall, it seems to me that it would be easier than a community engagement process for a brand new right of way.
Excellent. Thanks, Nicole. Okay, I think the clock is about to strike 1 here. Maybe I do want to thank Sam Bierstow on the Acadia team, who's been the Wizard of Oz behind the screen here, manipulating the webinar. Thank you, Sam. If you want to flash up, if you're able to, that last slide, we'll just do a quick farewell and wrap up. Thank you again, everyone, for joining. I hope you found it to be a solid power hour of siting discussion. A lot more to come. We really don't want this report to be something that just lives on a shelf. So we are planning sort of further outreach in phase 2 of this project. But if you want to get engaged with us, please reach out to any of us. Our contact info is there on the slide. And again, you will get a copy of the slides and the recording by virtue of having registered. So yeah, this isn't farewell forever, but it's bye for now, and hope we're able to continue to stay engaged on this really important topic for New England's grid and New England's communities going forward. So with that, we'll say thank you and goodbye.